What if the most extraordinary things Jesus ever said were never meant to disappear, and yet they almost did? For nearly 2,000 years, billions of people have believed they knew the words of Jesus. But what if the most remarkable things he ever taught never made it into the Bible they grew up reading? This is not a story about conspiracy or scandal. It is a story about time, human fragility, ancient manuscripts buried in desert sands, and voices from the past that refuse to be completely silenced. Most of us who came to faith or simply came to curiosity through the familiar Gospels carry a quiet assumption that what is written on those pages represents the heart of everything Jesus taught. And in many ways, those texts are extraordinary, but scattered across ancient manuscripts, apocryphal traditions, and early church writings buried beneath centuries of sand and silence, are sayings attributed to Jesus that feel radically different from anything most people encountered in a Sunday school lesson. Some of them challenge, some of them unsettle, some of them carry a strange, piercing beauty that makes you wonder why they were ever left out at all. The story of how those sayings disappeared, and how some of them survived, is one of the most quietly astonishing stories in human history. Close your eyes and imagine the world nearly 2,000 years ago. Christianity is not yet the vast institution we recognize today. There is no single accepted Bible. There is no printing press. There are only small communities of believers gathering quietly in private homes across Egypt, Syria, Greece, and Rome, each group carrying their own scrolls, their own oral memories, their own deeply personal understanding of who Jesus was and what he came to teach. Some of these communities treasured sayings they believed had come directly from the man they followed. Not all of them agreed with each other. Not all of them preserved the same texts, and not all of them survived. That fragility is the heart of this story. The real forces shaping what survived and what disappeared were not powerful men making calculated decisions in secret rooms. They were quieter and far more heartbreaking. The deterioration of papyrus against moisture and heat, the devastation of war, the erosion of communities whose traditions simply vanished alongside them, and then gradually, an institutional process began deciding, over centuries, which writings would stand at the center of the Christian faith and which would be left behind. If you are drawn to the hidden teachings of Jesus, ancient Christianity, the mysteries woven into Scripture, and the layered symbolism behind the words attributed to Christ, subscribe to this channel. In this video, we are going to move beyond the familiar passages to examine 7 remarkable sayings connected with Jesus, carefully separating historical evidence from later interpretation and speculation. Because this video is not arguing that someone in power deliberately destroyed the true teachings of Jesus to protect a lie. That story, as dramatic as it sounds, does not hold up against what history actually shows. What history shows is something more nuanced and in many ways more unsettling. It shows us what happens when a living oral tradition must be written down, copied by imperfect human hands, translated across languages that cannot always carry the same weight of meaning, and preserved through centuries no one could have predicted. It asks us to sit with this, that the preservation of sacred truth and the loss of sacred truth were often happening at the same time, in the same hands. Today, we will examine 7 sayings connected with Jesus that exist outside the most familiar biblical tradition. We will trace where they were preserved, ask why they became obscure, and hold the deeper question of what they still have to offer anyone willing to seek them out. These are not marginal footnotes. They are windows into the wide and astonishing world of early Christianity, into the people who believed, with everything they had, that they were holding on to something that must not be lost. But before we can understand what was lost, we need to understand the world in which these words were first spoken, and the long, turbulent, heartbreaking journey those words had to survive just to reach us at all. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine a world before the Bible as you know it existed. There is no printing press. There is no bookstore. There is no single universally accepted collection of sacred writings that every Christian community holds in common. There is only the living, fragile network of people who carry the memory of Jesus across mountains, across seas, across the dangerous roads of the ancient Mediterranean world. Picture a small room in 1st century Egypt, or Syria, or the outer edges of the Roman Empire. A lamp burns low. A group of men and women are gathered in someone's home, passing a scroll from hand to hand. Most of them cannot read. The scroll is read aloud by the one among them who can, and the words they hear that evening, the stories, the teachings, the sayings attributed to the man they believe, changed everything, received not as printed text, but as living sound, as breath, as something that must be remembered by human memory alone, or lost before the night is over. This was the world in which the earliest Christian communities existed. Not a world of settled doctrines printed in official volumes, but a world of voices and manuscripts, of oral traditions and hand-copied letters, of teachers traveling from city to city, carrying teachings that differed in emphasis, in language, and sometimes in substance from what was being taught in the next city over. Christianity was not yet one thing. It was many things, growing simultaneously in many directions, shaped by the geography and culture and spiritual hunger of wherever it took root. And the physical reality of ancient knowledge was terrifyingly fragile. Every manuscript had to be copied by hand, letter by letter, line by linen, and every act of copying introduced the possibility of error. A tired scribe working by candlelight might misread a word. A translator moving from Aramaic to Greek, or from Greek to Coptic, or from Coptic to Latin, might choose an equivalent that shifted the meaning in ways too subtle to notice until centuries had passed. In each crossing of language and culture, something small could be lost or something unintended quietly added, and no one living at that moment would have known. Then there was the violence of history itself. Persecutions scattered communities. Fires consumed libraries. Wars ended the careful work of generations in a single afternoon. Entire Christian communities disappeared not as a theological decision, but simply because the people who carried those traditions were killed, exiled, or absorbed into larger movements that had no use for what they had preserved. When a community vanished, the texts they had treasured often vanished with them, not because anyone chose to destroy them, simply because there was no one left to copy them forward. Then, in the autumn of 1945, something extraordinary happened in the Egyptian desert near a place called Nag Hammadi. A farmer digging in the sand struck something hard. Inside a sealed clay jar buried in the earth, he found a collection of ancient manuscripts untouched for 1,600 years, leather-bound codices, pages of ancient Coptic text, an entire library of early Christian writings the world had forgotten existed. Among them was a text called the Gospel of Thomas, not a narrative of Jesus' life, but a stark collection of sayings. 114 of them, each introduced by the same quiet phrase, Jesus said. The scholarly world was shaken. Some of these sayings echoed the canonical Gospels closely. Others seemed to come from a different angle, entirely pointing toward inner transformation, a relationship with the divine that was intimate and immediate, rather than mediated through institution or ritual. And suddenly, the question historians had been circling for centuries became impossible to avoid. How many other voices had been speaking in the earliest centuries of Christianity? And where had those voices gone? The answer, as honest scholarship has continued to show, is complicated. It was not simply that powerful church councils gathered in some darkened room and decided to burn inconvenient texts. Some teachings were indeed excluded, found theologically dangerous or incompatible with the direction that mainstream Christianity was moving. But others disappeared for reasons far less dramatic. The communities that treasured them faded. The manuscripts were never copied into the new languages the growing church was using. The traditions that sustained them lost their institutional support and were slowly, quietly absorbed or forgotten. History does not always erase knowledge with a single deliberate act. Sometimes it simply stops paying attention. So now the question becomes unavoidable. What exactly were the forces that decided which words of Jesus would be remembered for 2,000 years, and which would be quietly, and sometimes permanently, left behind? Let us be honest about something uncomfortable. The story we want, the one where a single powerful institution made a single ruthless decision to silence the most challenging words of Jesus, is a cleaner story than the truth. It gives us a villain, a moment, someone to blame. But the actual history is stranger and more unsettling than any conspiracy, because the forces that shaped which teachings survived are not easy to condemn or even to identify. They are woven into the ordinary fabric of how human civilizations carry knowledge forward across centuries. The formation of the Christian canon was not a single event. It was a process stretching across hundreds of years, driven by disagreement, negotiation, geographic distance, and the practical realities of a world where every manuscript had to be copied by hand. Different Christian communities across the ancient Mediterranean were not reading the same texts. A community in Alexandria might treasure a collection of sayings that a community in Antioch had never encountered. A tradition cherished in Syria might be almost entirely unknown in Rome. Early Christian leaders debated intensely about which writings truly represented apostolic authority, and which were later inventions, regional practices, or the work of communities whose theology had diverged too far from what the emerging mainstream considered sound. Some of those debates were genuinely principled. Scholars and bishops examined texts with real care, asking hard questions about authorship, consistency, and spiritual coherence. But some decisions were also shaped by power, by which communities had the most institutional influence, which traditions had survived persecution most intact, and which theological visions had found favor with the political structures increasingly intersecting with Christian life. When the Roman Empire shifted its relationship with Christianity in the 4th century, those political realities began to matter in new ways. Standardization became not just a theological goal, but a practical and political one. And standardization, by its very nature, requires choices about what to include and what to leave outside the boundary. Here is the question the historical evidence genuinely supports, and it is worth sitting with. Were there teachings that certain early Christian authorities found inconvenient, not necessarily false, but inconvenient? Sayings that placed spiritual authority within the individual rather than within an institution. Teachings that suggested a person could encounter the divine directly, without mediation or hierarchy. Visions of the kingdom that could not be controlled, administered, or used to define who was inside and who was outside. There is evidence that at least some early Christian leaders were aware of texts carrying these themes and found them dangerous, not because they were obviously wrong, but because they were genuinely threatening to a certain vision of how the church should function. And yet, even this is only part of the story. Alongside whatever deliberate exclusions occurred, something slower and quieter was happening at the same time. Entire communities were disappearing. When the Gnostic communities of Egypt lost their institutional footing through suppression, assimilation, or the simple erosion of time, the texts they had treasured lost the communities that had kept them alive. Without a community to copy a manuscript, the manuscript does not survive. Without a tradition to teach a saying, the saying ceases to be taught. The Syriac Christian communities that had preserved some of the oldest strata of the Jesus tradition were gradually overwhelmed by historical forces far beyond any single theological dispute. Their libraries, their practices, their particular ways of understanding Much of it vanished not in a fire or a decree, but in the slow dissolution of the communities themselves. There is a painful irony in how we sometimes know these lost teachings at all. Some survived only because early Christian authorities quoted them in order to argue against them. The hostile witness preserved the very evidence it was trying to dismiss, but in the most diminished form possible, filtered through the perspective of those who rejected them, stripped of the communities that had given them meaning. And then there is simply forgetting the hardest force to reckon with because it has no face and no intention. A manuscript survives a century of persecution and is then lost because no one thought to copy it during a decade of relative peace. A tradition sustains itself across 3 generations and disappears because the 4th inherited a different set of priorities. History does not always erase knowledge with drama. Sometimes the most complete erasure is the one that happens without anyone noticing, in the silence between one generation's attention and the next generation's indifference. With that world now alive in your mind, its fragility, its diversity, its losses, both deliberate and accidental, at us finally meet the sayings themselves. 7 ancient voices that survived against extraordinary odds, still speaking, still asking something of anyone willing to hear them. The first saying is perhaps the most quietly revolutionary of them all. It appears in the Gospel of Thomas, in a form that has no direct parallel in the familiar canonical Gospels, and it carries within it an idea that must have felt like fire to the people who first heard it. Jesus, according to this tradition, told his followers that the kingdom was not something waiting for them in a distant future, was not something reserved for the powerful or the theologically credentialed, was not dispensed from above by those who held institutional authority. The kingdom, he said, was already within them. Consider what that meant in the ancient world. Communities of early followers of Jesus existed in a social landscape shaped by hierarchies at every level: political, religious, economic. Access to the sacred was typically mediated. Priests offered sacrifices. Temples controlled worship. Religious authority determined who stood close to the divine and who stood at a distance. Into that world came a saying that located the kingdom not in any of those external structures, but in the interior landscape of the human person. If this is what Jesus taught her, even if this is what certain early communities believed, he taught them, the implications are staggering. You do not need an institution to find what you are seeking. You do not need a mediator. You carry it with you. It is already there. It has always been there. The kingdom is not a destination. It is a discovery. It is not difficult to understand why this idea would have been both profoundly liberating and quietly threatening. A community that believed spiritual authority resided within the individual was a community that had less need for external structures to govern its relationship with the sacred, and a teaching tradition that centered on interior transformation rather than institutional participation was one that any emerging institution would need to handle carefully, either absorb it, reinterpret it, or let it quietly disappear from the center of what was being preserved. The second saying deepens the first: know yourself. This theme appears in sayings attributed to Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas with a directness that feels almost startling. The act of knowing oneself is presented not as ordinary introspection, not as the kind of self-reflection that leads to self-improvement in the modern sense, but as something far more consequential, as the doorway through which a person moves toward knowing the divine itself. To know what you are in this tradition is to begin to understand what God is. The journey inward and the journey toward the sacred are not 2 different journeys. They are the same journey, taken in the only direction that was ever available to a human being, through the territory of the self. There is something almost eerie about the way this idea echoes across traditions that had no contact with one another. The inscription above the temple at Delphi read, Know yourself. The Upanishads of ancient India traced the path to ultimate reality through the discovery of the self's true nature. The Sufi poets of medieval Persia returned again and again to the theme of self-knowledge as the path to divine encounter. And here, in a text buried in the Egyptian desert for nearly 16 centuries, a saying attributed to a teacher from Galilee points in the same direction. What does it mean that a tradition connected to Jesus would preserve this particular instruction? That to know yourself is to approach what is most real. It suggests that what was understood by at least some of his early followers was not merely a new set of rules or a new institutional framework. It was an invitation into a different quality of awareness entirely. The third saying is the one that stops people in their tracks when they first encounter it. Lift a stone and you will find me there. Split a piece of wood and I am there. These words, also preserved in the Gospel of Thomas, locate divine presence not in a temple, not in a ceremony, not in a sacred text read aloud in a designated space. They locate it in the materials of ordinary labor, in the grain of wood as it gives way under a blade, in the weight of stone being moved from one place to another. In the texture of the physical world that surrounded the people Jesus walked among every single day. This is a vision of the sacred that refuses to be contained. It does not wait for the Sabbath. It does not require a priest or a ritual, or even a prayer spoken in the right words. It saturates the ordinary. It is present in the work that human hands do in the course of a regular morning. And for a tradition that would eventually build magnificent cathedrals and develop elaborate liturgical systems, a saying like this one carried an implicit challenge. If the divine is already present in a piece of wood being split, what exactly is the temple for? Each of these first three sayings points towards something interior, immediate, and radically personal, a vision of spiritual life that does not wait for an institution or a ceremony, that finds the sacred not in the extraordinary, but in the closest reaches of ordinary human experience. The next four sayings take that vision even further, and they grow stranger and more beautiful as they go. The fourth saying arrives like someone quietly opening a window in a room you had forgotten was closed. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus is recorded as saying that the kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and that people do not see it. Not that the kingdom is coming, not that it will arrive after suffering and judgment. It is already present, already unfolded across the surface of everything you can see and touch on an ordinary morning. The only reason it feels absent is not that it has not yet arrived, is that something in the human eye has not yet learned how to receive it. This is one of the most quietly radical ideas in early Christian literature. If the kingdom is not a destination across time, but a reality across perception, then the spiritual life is not a matter of waiting. It is a matter of waking. The journey is not from here to somewhere else. It is from blindness to sight, from the surface of things to the depth already present within them. For early Christian communities living under occupation and the daily weight of survival, this saying must have been both comfort and challenge. Comfort, because the thing they longed for was not withheld. Challenge, because it was not hidden somewhere beyond their reach. It was hidden inside the ordinary, waiting for them to learn a different way of looking. Nothing about your ordinary life needs to change its location for the sacred to become visible. It needs to change its depth. The fifth saying is briefer and stranger, and it has spent 2,000 years quietly unsettling everyone who encounters it. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says simply, "Become passers-by." No elaboration, no parable. Just the image of the figure who moves through a landscape without being consumed by it, who sees without clinging, who participates without being entirely defined by what is temporary. The Buddhist tradition speaks of living fully in the present while releasing craving. The Stoics asked students to hold external things lightly. Jewish mystical traditions have long wrestled with how a person remains whole in the middle of an ordinary and chaotic world. To become a passerby is to live with that quality of attention present, awake, genuinely engaged while never forgetting that the landscape you are moving through is not your final home. It is not coldness, it is freedom. The sixth saying moves inward, and it burns. Across fragmentary forms and early Christian writings, a recurring image appears. Inside every person there is a light, and if that light is allowed to shine, it illuminates the whole world. If it fails to shine, there is a darkness that touches everything. This was not a comfortable idea for institutions to manage, because if the divine light is already burning inside every person from the very beginning, not installed by baptism, not earned through obedience, not granted by priestly authority, then the relationship between the human being and the sacred is not mediated by structure. It is immediate. It is interior. What the traditions preserving these sayings asked was not whether you could be given the light, but whether you were willing to stop burying what was already inside you. And then the seventh saying gathers all six before it and holds them up like a single flame. The one who seeks will find. The one who knocks, it will be opened. The one who does not stop asking will eventually receive an answer. This is the most familiar sounding of the seven, and in its implications the most demanding, because seeking is not a moment. It is not a single sincere prayer offered once with genuine emotion. Seeking, as it appears across the traditions that preserved these words, is a practice patient, lifelong, sometimes uncomfortable, often pursued without any guarantee that the answer will arrive in the form you expected or at the time you hoped for. And here is where the central revelation finally becomes clear. The most hidden teaching was never a secret sentence locked inside a forgotten manuscript. It was not suppressed because it was dangerous to authority, though some of these sayings certainly challenged institutional frameworks. The most hidden teaching was the instruction itself. Keep seeking, keep questioning, keep pressing into the deepest layers of what you believe and why you believe it. Because the search is not what you do until you find the truth. The search is what the truth asks of you. 7 sayings, 7 windows into a world of early Christian thought that most people have never encountered. But the real question, the one waiting beneath every word of this video, was not just where these sayings came from, or who preserved them. It is why, after 2,000 years, they still feel so urgently and almost unbearably alive. And yet here we are, still asking. That is perhaps the most remarkable thing about these 7 sayings. Not where they were found, not the centuries they spent, buried or debated or dismissed, but the simple, undeniable fact that when you hear them, something in you recognizes them. Something older than your education, older than the tradition you were raised in, older than the particular language these words were preserved in. They land with a weight that feels less like discovery and more like memory. The ideas carried inside these sayings did not disappear when the manuscripts were set aside. They moved. They traveled through the writings of the early desert fathers, those extraordinary men and women who retreated into the Egyptian wilderness in the 3rd and 4th centuries and spent their lives pressing into exactly the questions these sayings raise. What does it mean to strip the self down to something essential, to seek the divine not in grand institutions but in the silent geography of the interior life? They moved through the great monastic traditions of the medieval world, where contemplatives developed entire vocabularies for the experience of inner transformation and the presence of the sacred woven into the fabric of ordinary existence. They moved through the Renaissance philosophers who rediscovered the ancient world and found themselves drawn again and again to the mystery of self-knowledge, to the old inscription above the temple at Delphi, to the quiet conviction that understanding what we are is somehow the doorway to understanding everything else. They moved through the Romantic poets who looked at a piece of wood, at a field of grass, at a shaft of morning light through a window, and felt something they could only describe as present. They moved through depth psychology, through Carl Jung's lifelong investigation into the inner world and the strange figures that inhabit it, through the conviction that the kingdom, whatever it is, lies closer to us than we have been taught to look. And they move today, through conversations people have at 2 a.m. when they cannot sleep, through the quiet desperation of someone sitting with a question they have never been given permission to ask, through every person who has ever felt that the version of spiritual truth they were handed was somehow smaller than the longing it was meant to answer. So, were these sayings erased? The honest answer is that the truth is layered, and it does not flatten easily into a simple story of heroes and villains. Some of these teachings were deliberately excluded from the emerging Christian canon by authorities who found them theologically problematic, who worried about what they implied about the nature of the church, the nature of salvation, the nature of who was allowed to know what. That is real. That happened. Some survived only inside communities that eventually disappeared, communities that carried their traditions into silence when they were absorbed, scattered, or destroyed by the movements of history. Some were lost through manuscript destruction, through fire and flood and the casual violence of time. And some were simply forgotten, not through any dramatic act of suppression, but through the slow and ordinary drift of a world, moving on, which is perhaps the most human form of loss there is, because it requires no enemy, only time. But here is what stays with you when you hold all of that together. The deeper mystery is not that 7 sayings disappeared. It is that they survived at all, that voices buried in desert sand for 16 centuries, wrapped in leather, hidden in a jar, could be lifted out and read and feel not ancient, not distant, not foreign, but immediate, still warm, still speaking directly into the exact center of the questions that keep modern people awake at night about meaning and identity, and the nature of whatever we reach toward when we reach toward something larger than ourselves. Ancient teachings do not always survive as books. They do not always survive as institutions or as carefully transmitted doctrines, passed hand to hand through authorized channels. Sometimes they survive as questions, living inside the human longing to understand, carried forward not because anyone commanded that they be preserved, but because the questions themselves refuse to go quiet, because the desire for inner transformation, for self-knowledge, for the experience of the sacred woven into the ordinary, for the freedom that comes from learning to hold the world lightly. These are not theological preferences. They are something closer to the permanent furniture of human experience. And perhaps the greatest gift of these 7 sayings is not the answers they provide. It is the quality of searching they invite, the invitation to go deeper than the surface of what you have been told, to sit with the uncomfortable and the unresolved, to let a question live inside you long enough to change you, which is, in its own way, exactly the kingdom they describe. Because sometimes the greatest mysteries are not the things history destroyed. They are the questions it left behind, still unanswered, still burning, still waiting for anyone with the courage and the patience and the willingness to keep asking them.